Good day. My name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. And welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. This is a discussion driven show that really examines some of the critical issues in the criminal justice arena. It was started by the Fortune Society to support with advocacy and policy initiatives and to be able to express views that oftentimes are not heard in mainstream media. Today, we're going to talk about something that's really, really important. One is about voting, and two is about what is happening within the prison jails or the prisons themselves in terms of abuse, in terms of the importance of making sure there's oversight within the prisons. So, with the November elections upon us, it is more important than ever for people to know how vital it is to vote. This is especially true for people who had justice involvement. Yet, it has been common practice in the country to make tens of thousands of people convicted of felonies to be ineligible to vote, in some cases permanently. Over the last few decades, the general trend has been toward reinstating the right to vote at some point, although this is a state-by-state policy choice. Today, we're going to speak with experts about the right to vote for people who have justice involvement and how they can actually go about doing so. And meanwhile, with police brutality in the national spotlight, it is also time to bring attention to corrections officer brutality inside jails and prisons. What has been recommended is for COs to be held accountable for their actions, that transparency be established to know which officers have histories of abuse, and that an independent entity have unrestricted access to enter prisons and jails to learn about CO's conduct. Our guests today are Terrell Muhammad of the Correctional Association of New York, who will discuss a new bill that will allow the organization to have full access to facilities without warning. Also, Dante A. Abesteki, who is from the Legal Action Center. And if I pronounced your names wrong, I really apologize for that. Thank you so much for joining us here on both sides of the bars. Terrell and Dante, thank you. Me. And Dante, what's the correct pronunciation of your last name?
Apaestegi. Dante
Apaestegi. Again, yep. Thank you, Dante Apaestegi. And so again, I apologize for the mispronunciation of your name. So we'll jump right into it. We know that we had maybe 80 days or so left for the national election. And this is a really critical kind of election that's happening. And so I'd like to obviously get your perspective. First, Dante, share with us what the Legal Action Center is and does, because the Legal Action Center is like really responsible for doing a lot of voter education, especially as it relates to felony enfranchisement. So talk to us about the Legal Action Center and talk to us about like the importance of voting in that context.
Yeah. So again, thank you for having me on your show. It really is a pleasure being here. The Legal Action Center is a public interest law firm that uses legal and policy strategies to fight against discrimination, build health equity, and restore opportunity for people with criminal records, substance use disorders, and HIV or AIDS. So, the way we go about doing that work and fighting that discrimination looks differently. We are involved in collaborations and coalitions. We provide webinar trainings and presentations. We provide direct legal services, policy advocacy, impact litigation. So the Legal Action Center is really involved in a lot of areas against this fight against discrimination. But that's a little bit of what Legal Action Center does. So yeah, that's just a quick brief overview.
Yeah, and so I know that a part of the work that Legal Action Center is doing has all to do with informing people who've had justice involvement about the importance of voting. Talk about that work that you've been doing and Legal Action Center is doing.
Yeah, so the Legal Action Center has some publications on voting rights in New York State. The first publication was Voting Rights Pamphlet in 2018 titled Voting and Criminal Records. Our newest publication on voting rights is a video we published just last month that we hope makes the information we initially published in 2018 more digestible and engaging for our community members. So we do a lot of work in just empowering our community members and knowing what their voting rights are in an effort to dispel this myth that people with criminal convictions, specifically felony convictions, cannot vote. So just to speak a little more to that video, the video is structured in such a way that the viewer can visualize a different situation or stages that they may find themselves in the justice system, and in turn learn what their voting eligibility would be while in that situation. So it's a 5-minute long video, and we at the Legal Action Center truly believe it'll help demystify this myth and help empower our community members to vote.
So I know that this video, right, which is really powerful, I viewed it, shared it with folk at the Fortune Society. It's accessible to the population, right? So anyone in the general public can access Legal Action's website and be able to see this, right, and share with others, correct?
Correct. Yes, it is available to everyone, and you could visit our website at www.lac.org to view the voting rights video and so many other resources that speak to the work we do when fighting discrimination in other areas.
Got it. And Terrell, we're going to circle in with you too about the work that the Correctional Association is doing. But Dante, like, talk to our listening audience. What are the contents of the video, right? Speak to our listening audience about, like, what rights do people have to vote while incarcerated, and how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so in New York State, only felony convictions that lead to incarceration limit the right to vote. So if someone is awaiting trial, received a misdemeanor or a violation conviction, is on probation, or finished their sentence for any convictions they received, they are eligible to vote. Now, for those who received felony convictions, it is very likely that they can vote despite their criminal record. The reasons I say that is because there are 2 things in New York that can restore someone's right to vote: a certificate of relief or a voting restoration pardon. Now, these are things that the video really just lays out and structures in such a way that makes it really digestible for the viewer in an effort to know what their voting rights are, given that this can be somewhat of a complicated and nuanced eligibility criteria that needs to be understood. So again, going back to the 2 things that New York has that restores someone's right to vote, specifically those who have felony convictions, it's either a certificate of relief or a voting restoration pardon. To make the distinction clear, certificate of relief from disabilities is a certificate that you need to apply for in New York State. If you're granted the certificate of relief, it restores your right to vote when either in jail for a felony conviction or when on parole or post-release supervision. The certificate can also be presented to a prospective employer as evidence of one's rehabilitation when an employer is requesting additional information based on the results of a background check. On the other hand, a voting restoration pardon is a result of an executive order signed in April 2018. It restores the right to vote for those on parole or post-release supervision. However, it's important to note that the voting restoration pardons do not seal or expunge records. It is solely intended for the restoration of voting rights. Voting restoration pardons are given automatically, so there really is no need for you to apply for them. You know, people can find out if they received a voting restoration pardon by simply looking themselves up in the parolee lookup website. So again, it's just important to note that those 2 things, certificate of relief and voting restoration pardon, restore one's right to vote in the state of New York.
So when people obviously are released from prison, right, and they're on parole, they do have access to vote. Is that correct, Dante?
Correct. So if someone is on parole, through the voting restoration pardon, which is given automatically to folks, they could register to vote. So if they register to vote before they received a felony conviction and haven't registered since, they should re-register through the DMV or through their county board of elections. If someone is is currently in jail, is in pretrial, awaiting trial, then they should have access to vote through an absentee ballot.
Now, does any offense preclude anyone from accessing the right to vote, right, upon their release? Are there any offense?
No, there are no offenses that preclude anyone to vote. It really comes down to what situation or what circumstance one finds themselves in to determine if they are eligible. If they need a certificate, if they need a voting restoration pardon, or if they if they don't need either one of those things, they just have the right to vote. So to reiterate, if someone has a misdemeanor, received a misdemeanor, or a violation charge or conviction, they can vote. If someone is on probation for any conviction, they have the right to vote. They can register and vote. If someone is currently in jail for a felony conviction, they would need a certificate of relief. If someone is in prison for a felony conviction, unfortunately, they don't have the right to vote just yet. It is upon being placed on parole or post-release supervision that they have that right restored through a voting restoration pardon or a certificate of relief or a certificate of good conduct. And lastly, if someone completely finished their sentence in its entirety, including any parole or post-release and supervision that they might have been subject to, upon finishing one sentence, your right to vote is automatically restored. No need for a certificate or a voting restoration pardon.
Now, are there any other states that are more progressive, Dante, that allows for people while in jail the right to vote in some way? Do you know of any of that exist?
Yeah, so I mean, two states really stand out of all of the 50, and it's Vermont and Maine, who actually don't have any restrictions, don't preclude anyone from voting, despite regardless of what is on their criminal record. So I would say that those two are really important states in that conversation. I will say this: there has been progress that has been made recently. The Iowa governor recently created a pathway for people on felony convictions to vote. So granted, there is still a lot of work to be done in the area of voting rights, but for the first time, people with felony convictions can vote in all 50 states.
Rights, right? Speaking of rights, I want to kind of transition now to Terrell Muhammad. Terrell Muhammad is one of the representatives from the Correctional Association, an entity that kind of oversees the actions of correctional officers and what has happened to people inside. So Terrell, thank you so much for joining us too for this conversation. And we're talking about rights, right? And moving away for a little bit from voting rights, but the rights of people who've had justice involvement more specifically. Talk to us, Terrell, about what the Correctional Association does, right? And then some of the work that's been done by you and others to move forward a bill that's now with the governor that gives the Correctional Association more of an opportunity to have oversight in prisons. So talk to us about that, Terrell.
In a nutshell, Correctional Association is the independent oversight of New York State correctional facilities. They have the authority to go inside, to monitor the conditions, and report to the legislator, the public at large, and the commissioner, the conditions that we find. Out of 50 states, there's prisons. In each state, there are only 3 oversight agencies in America. One in Chicago, one in Philadelphia, and New York. So in a nutshell, like I said, what we do, we go in, we try to be the video camera, the cell phone camera that can't be provided on the inside. And we try to get those voices, those narratives out, and those experiences out, and the conditions out, and the treatment out to the public at large, because they're taxpayers. And those people that's incarcerated by the state, they do have rights that's still intact. They're human beings, first and foremost, and they have the right to live as human beings.
And speaking of that, Terrell, you know, you talk about like you are the cell phone and the camera, right? Correctional Association serves as that. Like, what are some of the things that Correctional Association is hearing that's happening to the people that's incarcerated? I think it's important for our listening audience to know, right? Because there are abuses and brutalities that take place within the correctional settings that often go unheard. So talk about some of those incidents that you all obviously record or observe.
Prior to COVID, let's talk about medical. Prior to COVID, the Department of Corrections had a real dismal record dealing with medical. They have a process called the grievance process, where men and women are able to complain about conditions or treatment or policies or directives. And they'll be able to utilize this mechanism. In this mechanism, the number one complaint is medical. At every facility, there's 52 facilities in New York State. Every facility we go to and we ask what's the number one complaint, it's medical. Lack of services, denial of services, misdiagnosis, deaths that are preventable, horrendous. It's hard. There are facilities that don't even have a dentist on staff. You know, these are the conditions prior to COVID. So now let's talk about COVID. If these were the conditions prior to COVID, then you know these people are suffering and they're dying by the days because the conditions are not equipped to handle a pandemic. And the calls that we're getting are horrendous. People are quarantined in solitary confinement and given a bucket just to get water to bathe themselves because staff is afraid for them to come out. Men are being punished if they even at the time when they were not allowing them to make makeshift masks, they were being punished because they had masks on that they were trying to protect themselves with because they weren't being provided anything for at least over 100 days. It took a campaign, I think with Mercy Collins and others, just to get donations of protective equipment for the men and women inside. So can you imagine having to have a donation and these people are wards of the state and the state can't provide for their health and safety? So what we hear daily, phone calls, emails, is that people are definitely suffering. Not enough information is being given to them about how to protect themselves, and they don't know what to do. Mental health patients are suffering doubly the cost under these conditions because there's only one mental health provider at the facility, per facility, that's coming to work. And they might have a caseload, just one provider might have a caseload of maybe 200. Humanly impossible to take care, dispense medications, and give the necessary treatment under these conditions to those men and women. So, you know, I get letters every day, Brother Andre. I can go on. And it's not something that my staff are really spiritually and mentally capable to deal with at times because the depressing complaints sometimes become overwhelming. And we always seek ways and strategies and policies to alleviate some of the conditions that are horrible. The Correctional Association has been around 175 years. They've done remarkable work, created many historical legislations that help change the landscape of how people are treated and dealt with in correctional settings in New York State. And when you would think after 175 years, we've made some tremendous strides, in which we have. But when I look at the conditions that I go in and see, I can see conditions that I endured over 30 years ago, still being played out. So it's much work still to be done.
Absolutely, Terrell. And so, with all of that Correctional Association observes, all the reporting that happens to you, all of what you have experienced while being involved with the Correctional Association, I know and understand that there's been some steps made now to giving the Correctional Association some more power and oversight with this bill. And I don't know if you care to talk a little bit about that and what that bill looks to do in some way.
Let me just be brief. And I want to give credit to my colleague, Phil Miller. At the Correctional Association, we're really unique because 80% of our staff is formerly incarcerated, and they do tremendous work. Phil Miller crafted this, and this is prior to COVID, prior to the turmoil that's going on in the world, because this was on our radar to try to increase our authority. And when he wrote this up, these are some of the requests that are now part of the bill. 1, allow county to access any docks correctional facility at any time without advance notice. 2, request dock staff to keep their distance, which county representatives are speaking with or interviewing incarcerated people or dock staff. 3, prohibit docks from placing any time constraints or limitation on how many people county can interview during the duration of our monitoring visits. 4, provide unfettered access to docs documents, records, without the need for FOIL requests, and with the caveat of anything being deemed contraband must be kept confidential by the Correctional Association. 5, require other state agencies to share their documents and records with county if those records pertain a state correctional facility or its staff or anyone incarceration therein. And lastly, it allows county to request a court to hold docs in contempt for the failure to comply with any of the above section of the bill. So, these is just some of the caveats that we have in there. And at one time, we couldn't do that. We used to have to give 30-day notice to go to a facility. At one time, we were shadowed closely by doc staff from the council's office to the administration of the facility. And with that type of shadowing, many of the men and women, were hesitant to even be forthcoming and speak to us because of the intimidation factor. So, we had to alleviate all of these restraints and constraints that docs were always putting in our way, making it hard to just get the truth out. So with these impediments out of the way, we believe that we can be more effective, bring more information to the general public at large and legislatures, and then have the general public understand that this is what's happening. It might not be New York Times news because we don't have video footage, but I can give you narratives of thousands of men and women in New York State who talk about the brutality they have to suffer unnecessarily just to be denied a shower. One of the most decent and common human things to do, to bathe. An officer would just deny that person a shower on the whim of it. It don't have to be no misbehavior. The person don't have to be acting out. It's up to the discretion of the officer how he feels that day. Should I give a person a shower? And they call that putting me on the burn. So these type of unchecked behaviors now can be checked now. And always please excuse my passion, because, and doing this work and doing this work for some time, you have to be committed and passionate about it.
Absolutely, Terrell. And thinking about that too, and shifting to Dante, right? And the work that Legal Action Center is doing around voting, right? You can see, and we can see, right, based on what Terrell described, the conditions, why it's so important to vote. So talk a little bit about that context and correlation, right? And voting, right, to support changing some conditions, the power it gives people that have justice involvement by voting and what it can do.
I want to show you. Let me show you a historical incident in New York State, too. In 1984, Jesse Jackson was running for the Democratic Party presidential nomination. I was in Elmira Correctional Facility. I was a part of the NAACP. We reached out to Hazel Dukes, who was the president and is the current president of the New York State chapter of the NAACP. And the men at Elmira were adolescents at that time. And most of our people who were coming to see us were not registered voters. And we brought that to the attention of Hazel Dukes. Just bringing this to her attention, she was able to advocate to the governor at that time, Mario Cuomo Sr., to allow this one facility, Elmira, to have voter registration in the visiting room. Just doing that changed the whole dynamics, how the police treated everyone. The families, the men inside, and we didn't have the right to vote. We were just registering people. So I know that if we get the power to actually vote, we'll change so many of the things that are happening. But mainly, the power should be given us to vote so we can change the condition in our lives. I don't want to have the vote to live in the Hilton Hotel, that's incarceration. You know, you remember, you know, at the time when we were inside, you know, they were trying to offer TVs and people were battling that issue. Like, we're not here for comfort. You know, give us better education, give us better vocational tools that we can be better people upon our release. We're not trying to be comfortable here, you see? So, you know, that has to be an educational component with that right to vote.
Absolutely. Dante, your thoughts on that, right? Because there's relationship there, right? With what LAC is doing and our maybe like 2 minutes left. Like, give us some context too as that relates to what Terrell is describing and the importance of voting.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the reality is that many, if not all, who are just as involved experience an overwhelming loss of rights and privileges on both sides of the bars, if you will, right? So our work is to tear down the myth that justice-involved people cannot vote. And we work to eliminate and lower those criminal record barriers that sustain so much of the felony disenfranchisement that we're talking about. You know, and it starts with acknowledging what John Lewis said just last year. You know, the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democracy. So I am so glad to see that we're having this discussion and that, you know, the Correctional Association is really, you know, there to empower the people, the folks inside to know what their rights and protections are, and the Legal Action Center outside, and empowering those same community members to know what their voting rights are in New York State.
Absolutely. So if you can leave our listening audience with ways in which to get in contact with the Legal Action Center and then Correctional Association, please do, as we unfortunately have to wrap this Both Sides of the Bar segments up in a minute.
You can Google CANI or the Correctional Association and it'll come up. And you would like to write to us, write to CANI, C-A-N-Y, P.O. Box 793, Brooklyn, New York, 11207, in East New York.
Thank you so much, Terrell. Dante?
Yes, and you can see the Legal Action Center's voting rights and many other resources at www.lac.org/resources, or call us to get connected with our direct legal services at 212-243-131.
Terrell, Dante, and for all of the listeners who have joined us today, we thank you so very much for listening to this segment of Both Sides of the Bars.